Act 1, the cold-hearted Mafia werewolf boss. Vincenzo sat at the polished obsidian desk, fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes locked on the screen before him. The glow of the laptop illuminated the sharp angles of his face, casting long shadows across the room that stretched like the fingers of some unseen monster. The soft hum of the air conditioning barely reached his ears as the message popped up, cold, calculated, and exacting. The hit was set. A target, a name, a location. It was just another night in his empire, another execution to ensure the delicate balance of power remained in his grasp. His fingers hovered over the keys, every movement deliberate. One click and the deed would be done. A life snuffed out in the blink of an eye. Vincenzo paused. The weight of his decision settled in his chest like lead. He had killed countless men in his rise to the top. Men who had betrayed him, crossed him, or simply stood in his way. But this time, something felt different. Is this what I've become? The thought passed through his mind before he could shove it away. It wasn't weakness, it wasn't doubt. It was the reality of his world, one where loyalty and betrayal were two sides of the same coin. If you weren't willing to get your hands dirty, you'd be buried 6 feet under before the dawn. Still something gnawed at him, a feeling he couldn't shake. Vincenzo's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. He was a monster. He knew it, embraced it. But damn it, why did it feel like he was losing pieces of himself? Focus. With a snap of his wrist he closed the laptop, the light fading into the darkness. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the walls of his office. His kingdom. The empire built on blood, betrayal, and ruthless ambition. Alone? He was used to it. It was the price of power. But damn if it didn't sting tonight. The emptiness in the room was louder than any gunshot, and it gnawed at his insides. He'd never allow himself to show weakness. He couldn't afford it. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. "Boss, it's ready." Vincenzo didn't respond. His eyes lingered on the shadows in the corner, his thoughts wandering to the same place they always did when things were quiet. He wanted to feel something, anything, but that was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not in his world. Not when lives hung in the balance. Isabella's heart pounded in her chest as she sprinted down the dark alley, her breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. The night air felt thick, heavy, as if the city itself was holding its breath. She could hear the footsteps behind her. Harder. Steady. Relentless. Her pursuers were close, but she couldn't let them catch her. Not now. She darted around a corner, pressing her back against the cold brick wall of a forgotten building, listening for any sign of movement. Her hand brushed against the blade hidden beneath her jacket, a simple thing, but deadly in the right hands. She wasn't just running from these men, she was hunting them. They had no idea how deep in the game she was. How many times had she been underestimated? Her fingers tightened around the hilt of the knife, her mind clear, focused. She wasn't the same girl she had been when she first stepped into this dark world. Wide-eyed, naive, looking for a way out. Now she was a survivor. A player in this game, and she wasn't about to lose. The sound of footsteps grew closer. She swallowed, holding her breath. 3 of them. She could hear their voices now, low and rough as they argued about where she'd gone. They weren't paying attention, just like they never did. Perfect. In one smooth motion, Isabella pushed herself off the wall, her body moving like water. Fluid, fast, she darted forward, slamming the edge of the knife into the first man's side before he had a chance to react. The shock of it registered too late, and he crumpled to the ground, blood pooling beneath him. The second man turned in time to see her swipe at him, narrowly missing the strike. He grinned, drawing a gun from his belt, but Isabella was already gone, vanishing into the shadows of the alley once more. She didn't need to look back to know she had them where she wanted them. She was better than this. Better than the men who thought they could chase her down, catch her, use her. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Isabella felt the familiar heat in her veins, the rush of adrenaline flooding her senses. She was alive, and for the first time in a long time she felt the dangerous thrill of being in control. As Vincenzo stepped out of his office and into the dimly lit hallway, the image of the woman, the one whose name he'd just been given, pulsed in his mind. Isabella. He'd seen her file. A nameless figure moving through the underworld like a shadow, with a reputation that had caught the attention of even his most trusted men. But something about her caught his attention, something in the way she moved, the quiet ferocity that exuded from her. It intrigued him. Vincenzo wasn't in the habit of being intrigued. But then again, there was something else about her, a challenge, a defiance that mirrored his own. As he stepped into the elevator, he thought about her again. His hand clenched at his side, the muscle in his jaw tightening. The game was changing. Isabella took a breath, watching the last of her pursuers fall to the ground, blood staining the pavement beneath them. She stood tall, unshaken, her body tense, every sense alert. It was easy to forget, sometimes, the stakes, the danger. But she was reminded now. She knew this life. The underworld didn't care about the weak. It didn't care about loyalty or love. It took what it wanted, when it wanted. But she wasn't weak. She wasn't just surviving. She was winning. The sound of distant sirens pulled her from her thoughts. She glanced up at the looming skyline, a city of steel and glass, where every corner had its own hidden danger. Her pulse slowed, the rush of victory fading as reality set in. Tomorrow would bring another challenge, another fight. She wouldn't stop, not until she had everything. As Vincenzo watched the city from his penthouse window, he could feel the pull of the night, of the moon hanging heavy in the sky. His body itched with a restless energy, a primal need that he couldn't ignore. He turned away from the window, heading toward his private quarters. He wasn't sure why his thoughts kept drifting back to Isabella, but they were. Her defiance, her strength. She was dangerous, but then so was he. And now their paths were about to cross in ways neither of them could predict. The full moon was high in the sky, casting its pale light over the world below, and fate, as always, had its own plans. The city was silent, the streets bathed in moonlight as the full moon climbed higher into the sky, but in Vincenzo's world, silence never lasted long. Tonight it was heavy with anticipation, the kind of stillness that came right before a storm. He stood in the penthouse balcony, staring out over the city's skyline, the sharp wind tousling his hair. His breath was steady, his gaze cold, as always. But there was something different in the air tonight. The moon. It had always been a reminder of what he was, what he could never escape. His body, already humming with the restless energy of his wolf, seemed to respond to its pull, the ancient rhythm of the night taking hold of him. His blood was hot, coursing faster beneath his skin, calling to something deeper, something primal. He needed to get this over with. Turning away from the window, Vincenzo's eyes locked on the table before him. The picture of the woman, the target, was still there, taunting him. Isabella. No last name, no background, just a name and a mission. Eliminate her. But that was before everything had changed. Before fate intervened. His fingers tightened around the glass of whiskey in his hand. A sharp knock on the door and his gaze lifted, his mood turning colder. "Come in." The door opened, and a man stepped inside, his expression tense. "Boss, she's here." Vincenzo nodded. His heart, if it still had one, pounded in his chest. He took one last slow sip of whiskey and set the glass down, his eyes fixed on the door. This was it, the moment he'd been preparing for. The hit. His mind cleared, his instinct sharp. He would do it swiftly, and then he would leave it all behind, just as he always did. Isabella's heart was a hammer in her chest as she stepped into the dimly lit room. The air was thick with tension, too thick for comfort. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen as her eyes met Vincenzo's. She didn't flinch. didn't let her gaze waver. Vincenzo was everything they'd said. Dangerous, ruthless, commanding. His eyes bored into her like twin daggers. And yet there was something else there. Something she couldn't quite place. It made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up, and it wasn't just the palpable sense of impending violence. Her fingers brushed the cold steel of the hidden knife beneath her jacket. She wasn't here to die. She was here to survive. He was already moving toward her, his footsteps deliberate, his presence suffocating. She could hear his breathing now, shallow, almost measured. "Do you know why you're here?" Vincenzo's voice was low, the words laced with an accent that only made him more dangerous. She didn't answer, didn't need to. It wasn't about talking. It was about surviving. "You don't belong here," he said, his tone cutting through the air like a blade. Her body tensed, every muscle screaming to flee, but she stayed rooted to the spot. "I'm not afraid of you." Vincenzo's eyes flashed, the faintest of smirks tugged at his lips before it disappeared. "You should be." Then he moved faster than she could react. He reached out, his grip closing around her wrist with unrelenting force. A twist of his body, a flash of teeth, and she was slammed against the cold wall, the breath knocked from her lungs. The world spun, the pressure of his body against hers suffocating. But there was something else, something strange in the air, something otherworldly. And then it happened. A spark of energy shot through her body, sharp and electric, like nothing she'd ever felt. It surged through her veins, her heart pounding harder, faster, until it was the only thing she could feel. The room seemed to shift. The shadows pressed in closer, and suddenly she was aware of him, of the heat of his body, of the pulse racing in his chest. She could feel it, his heartbeat, as if it were her own. And then, as if summoned by the moon itself, a mark appeared on her skin, a jagged, glowing symbol, sharp, ancient, and impossible to ignore. Isabella gasped, her breath catching in her throat. "What the hell is this?" Vincenzo's grip tightened around her wrist, his face now inches from hers, his eyes wide with shock. His chest rose and fell with each strained breath. "No!" he murmured, his voice breaking through the haze that was enveloping them. "This... you..." Isabella's gaze dropped to her skin, to the mark that was burning its way into her. It was his? There. Mark. The mark of a mate. A bond that neither of them had asked for. A sudden violent rush of heat flooded her chest. She was choking on it, suffocating under its weight. Her eyes flicked back up to his, and for the first time she saw something other than cold detachment in his gaze. Fear. But it was gone as quickly as it had come. The sudden wave of energy left her disoriented, her thoughts fragmented, but she couldn't escape the pull of him, the pull of the bond. Vincenzo's lips parted, but no words came. He wasn't looking at her now. He was looking at the mark on her skin, his jaw tightening, his fists clenched. Isabella tried to jerk away, but he held her there. "No!" he growled, his voice barely a whisper. "You're not my—" She didn't care. She couldn't care. The pain and confusion surged within her, the bond tightening like a noose. She wasn't the woman who would accept a fate thrust upon her. She wasn't going to be his. "You're wrong," she snapped, struggling to break free of his grip. "I don't belong to you. I never will." But the bond, the mark, it didn't care what she wanted. It was fate, and fate had just chained her to the very thing she'd been trying to escape. Vincenzo's heart thudded painfully in his chest as she fought against him, her anger raw and palpable. His entire world was shifting on its axis, the reality of the situation crashing into him like a speeding train. He couldn't. This couldn't be happening. She didn't belong here. She couldn't belong to him. But the mark on her skin, the one that mirrored the one buried deep beneath his own, told him otherwise. It screamed otherwise. He fought it. He fought her. But deep down, beneath the layers of anger and shock, a part of him knew he could never undo it. She was his. and that terrified him more than anything else. The air was thick with tension, and it had nothing to do with the blood still fresh on the floor. Vincenzo's mind raced as he stood over Isabella, the weight of the bond between them pressing down on him, suffocating him. His chest ached, a low growl building in his throat that he fought to control. She wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to be feeling this. But the mark, glowing faintly on her skin, was undeniable, and the pull of it. God, the pull! Had his control slipping, unraveling, like thread pulled from the edge of a sweater? "Get her out of here!" he growled, his voice strained. His men hesitated, glancing at each other with confusion. The order had been simple: kill the woman. But the air around her was alive with something else, something neither they nor he could ignore. The thick silence was broken by the low, unsettling sound of Vincenzo's breath, steady but strained. The men finally moved, but his eyes never left Isabella as they approached her. She was on her knees now, her breath shallow, her body tense, as if ready to spring into action. She wasn't crying, wasn't begging. She was calculating her escape, already plotting her next move. Good. She'd survive. She was strong, but she would also learn that survival didn't come easy, not in this world. "Take her to the holding room," Vincenzo barked, his voice more forceful than he intended. "Then lock the door." Isabella's sharp gaze cut through him like a dagger thrown with precision. "Do you think I'm just going to let you lock me up like some animal?" she snapped, her voice low, fierce. Vincenzo clenched his jaw, the words barely escaping through his teeth. "Right now, I don't give a damn what you think." The holding room smelled like old leather and dust. Not the kind of place for someone like Isabella, who thrived on control, but that was the reality she now faced. Her fate had been decided, and no amount of resistance was going to change it. She sat on the edge of the small cot, hands clasped tightly together as she tried to ignore the buzzing feeling that had taken over her body. The bond. The fucking bond. She didn't want it. Didn't ask for it. But it was there, alive. Her body still thrummed with it, as if it were a part of her now. And it disgusted her. Her mind reeled. Vincenzo, the Mafia don, a man who lived in darkness, who thrived on fear and bloodshed, was now bound to her. Her, a woman who had spent her whole life fighting to stay free of this world. She was supposed to be a survivor, not some prize for a monster like him. A soft knock at the door broke through her spiraling thoughts. "Miss—" A guard started, but stopped when she shot him a glare sharp enough to cut glass. "I'm fine. Leave me the hell alone." Her voice was cool, controlled, but her fists clenched in her lap as the tremor in her body reminded her she wasn't as fine as she wanted to believe. He hesitated, but then walked away. Isabella exhaled slowly, rubbing her hands over her face. She needed to think. She needed to figure out a way out of here. Vincenzo leaned against the door of his office, his fingers rubbing the bridge of his nose as he tried to shove the chaos from his mind. His eyes burned from lack of sleep, but sleep wasn't the issue right now. Her. Isabella. The pull of the bond was like nothing he'd ever felt before. The moment it had anchored itself into his very being, it had felt like a goddamn shockwave, turning everything he thought he knew upside down. He didn't want it. He couldn't afford it. But there was no running from it now. She was his mate, bound by something older, more powerful than him. And he had no choice but to face it. The sound of footsteps approaching broke his reverie. He looked up, and for the first time in hours his expression softened just a fraction. His men stood outside the door. "She's locked in the room, boss. She's not causing trouble," Vincenzo nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm going in." The door to the holding room creaked open. He didn't need to announce his presence. He wasn't here to make small talk. But he wasn't expecting her to look at him like that. She didn't even flinch when he stepped inside. Her back was to him, but he could see her shoulders tense, as though preparing for a fight. That fire in her, the same fire that had burned through every obstacle she'd faced in this world, was there. It was what had made her dangerous. And what made her so damn complicated? "I told you to leave me alone," she spat, still not turning to face him. Vincenzo's lips twitched in something that almost resembled a smile, but it quickly vanished as he moved toward her. "You don't tell me what to do, sweetheart." Her eyes snapped up at the word, her gaze seething with contempt. "Sweetheart?" she scoffed. "You think I'm just some woman you can control? No!" His tone turned dark, and for the first time the mask slipped. He wasn't the cold Don anymore. He was raw. "But you're my responsibility now. You're mine, whether you like it or not." Isabella stood up quickly, the words cutting into her like a knife. "I'm not yours. I don't belong to you or your Mafia. I won't be anyone's fucking property." Vincenzo was too close. She could feel the heat of his body, the tension radiating off him in waves. "You don't get to decide that," he growled, taking a step forward. "The bond's already been made." Her chest tightened. She wasn't supposed to feel anything for him, anything. But the heat in his voice, the brutal edge to his words called to something deep within her, something she didn't want to acknowledge. "I didn't ask for this," she hissed, fighting the pull of his presence. "I didn't ask for any of this. The bond, the power, the fucking Mafia. You think I'm just going to bend to you?" Vincenzo's jaw tightened. "You don't have a choice." The air between them grew heavy. Their breaths came faster now, not from physical exertion, but from something else, something too real to ignore. She could feel it. The tension, the charge that hung between them. It was there, undeniable, threading through every word, every movement. "Damn you!" she whispered, her hands balling into fists at her sides. She wanted to scream. "Hit him! Run!" But instead she stood there, facing him, every inch of her wanting to reject what he was offering, what he was trying to impose on her. He was close enough now that she could feel his warmth, his presence consuming her space, wrapping around her like a vice. "You'll come to see it differently," he murmured, his voice a low, dangerous promise. He took one step forward, closing the distance until they were inches apart. "And when you do, you won't be able to walk away." Her heart thudded in her chest, and for a moment everything in her screamed to fight, to push him away. But that pull, the one that tethered her to him, the one she couldn't shake, had already taken root, and she hated him for it. The cold cement felt like ice beneath Isabella's bare feet, the sharp sting of the ground a reminder of her reality. She'd learned early on that the world didn't care about the broken or the forgotten, not the way it should. She had to fight for every inch, every scrap of dignity, or she'd be swallowed whole. She was barely 10 when she learned that lesson. Alone in the alley behind the butcher's shop, her stomach growling louder than the sounds of the traffic passing by. The stench of spoiled meat clung to the air, but she didn't mind. She didn't have the luxury of being picky. Not when hunger gnawed at her from the inside. She had to get the scraps, had to. Her hands shook as she reached through the broken fence, grabbing the edges of the leftover bags. She could hear the scuffling sound of her breath, the flutter of her heartbeat as she pulled a chunk of bread from the torn plastic. It wasn't much, but it was something. A scrape of a foot against the ground turned her head. She was too late. "Hey, get out of there!" a voice barked from behind. She didn't hesitate. She knew the drill. She bolted, feet pounding against the pavement, the world blurring around her. The man chased her, his footsteps heavy, but she was faster. Had to be. She cut through another alley, her chest tight, each breath a fight to stay ahead. Isabella pushed herself, faster and faster, until the man was nothing but a dark shadow in the distance. When she finally stopped, leaning against the brick of a rundown building, her chest heaved with the effort, her fingers dug into her side, blood mixing with the dirt and sweat as she wiped her face. She could feel it, the bruises, the cuts, the harshness of the world she couldn't escape. She hadn't asked for this life, for the endless struggle, but it was hers. And she was still here. That counted for something. At 15, Isabella was no longer just running from the world. She was starting to understand it. People weren't just hungry, they were predators. She crouched in the shadow of the alley, watching the men across the street. 2 of them. They didn't look like much, but they didn't have to. They were enough. Her fingers twitched as she reached into the back of her waistband, pulling out the knife. It was small, but it was sharp. It had saved her before. She knew the score. She knew when to make her move. But tonight she'd be careful. The 2 men moved toward her, their heads down, as if they didn't know she was there. She smiled to herself, her instincts kicking in, every muscle in her body coiled tight with anticipation. They were the kind of men who thought they could take whatever they wanted, the kind who thought she was an easy target. They were wrong. She stepped into the light, a casual stride, no fear in her eyes, just a steely resolve that told them she wasn't afraid to fight for what she needed. "Hey, little girl," one of them said, his voice low, his grin predatory. Isabella didn't flinch. "What's it to you?" she asked, voice calm but laced with a challenge. "Not much, sweetheart," the other one said, stepping closer. "Just a friendly chat. You look like someone who could use protection." She didn't move, didn't blink. "I'm not interested." Before they could react, she struck. Quick, sharp, precise. A twist of her wrist and the first man crumpled to the ground, a pained gasp escaping his lips. She didn't hesitate, spinning on her heel, facing the second man with her knife still raised. His eyes widened, panic flashing in them. He wasn't used to being on the receiving end of this. "Next time, don't try me," Isabella said, her voice cold, the remnants of a smile curling on her lips as she slid the knife back into her waistband. The man didn't argue, just backed away. She'd won. Again. She always did. Years passed, but nothing changed. The streets were still brutal. The hunger never fully went away. But Isabella had learned how to survive, how to play the game, how to manipulate the world into giving her what she needed. She learned that people, men especially, wanted something from her. They always had. Her body, her trust, her soul. They thought they could own her, control her, but no one ever would. Isabella sat in her small apartment now, the light of the street lamp casting long shadows across the room. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and her own breath. She should be resting, should be focused on the next move, but her mind kept drifting back to something she couldn't shake, the pull, the bond. It had been there since the moment she locked eyes with Vincenzo. At first, she thought it was just her heart racing, a natural reaction to the danger he exuded. But it was more than that. It was something deeper, primal, a force she couldn't explain or outrun. It gnawed at her from the inside. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to be tied to a man like him, a man who thrived on control, who had everything she fought to escape. She wouldn't be another pawn in his game. She wasn't anyone's property. Her chest tightened as the memories of the past few days flooded her, the encounter, the bond. Vincenzo's heat, his presence consuming her every time he came near. She had to escape. She had to get out of his world before it swallowed her whole. But a part of her was starting to wonder if that escape was ever possible. She had always fought to survive, to be more than what her past told her she was. She had fought with everything she had, and that was why she was still standing. But now, with Vincenzo so close, with the bond twisting around her like chains, she didn't know if she was winning anymore. Could she escape him? Could she keep the power that had kept her alive? Or was she already lost? Vincenzo stood in front of the window, staring out at the city. The light below flickered, offering false comfort against the endless night. His mind didn't register the view. It never did. He only saw the memories, flashing behind his eyes like a film he couldn't turn off. The sound of rain pattering against the old windows was the only noise in the room. The small, dimly lit office was a far cry from the grand structures of the Mafia families he would come to rule. He was only 15 then, younger than most would have expected. But the weight of his family's expectations was heavy even then. He watched his father across the room, his face set in stone. Vincenzo's heart thudded painfully in his chest, as the memory came flooding back with sharp clarity. His father's words, cold as ice, sliced through the still air. "You will never be more than what I make you. You will never be more than the family name." His father's eyes glinted with a promise that Vincenzo would pay for his bloodline's sins, that his own life would be consumed by the shadows of those who came before him. Betrayal had been his father's currency, and Vincenzo had learned it well. He didn't have the luxury of choosing loyalty. It was something you demanded, something you broke when it was convenient. The memory stung in a way he'd never been able to push away. It was the beginning of the end, the day he knew that his own heart would become a weapon. It wasn't long after that betrayal seeped into his blood like poison. His bestie friend, Matteo, the one person Vincenzo thought he could trust. Matteo had betrayed him, sold him out to the highest bidder. The rage had been a slow burn at first, an ember inside him. But the moment he found Matteo's lifeless body in a back alley, the ember turned to fire. That night, Vincenzo had made a choice. No one would ever get close enough to break him again, and if they did, he would break them first. His breath caught in his chest as the memory shifted. It was a woman this time, a figure blurred in the darkness of his mind. He could almost feel her hands brushing against his skin, the soft whisper of her voice in the night, the first time he'd let someone in. Her name was Clara, a brief, fleeting encounter that had almost undone him. He hadn't wanted to be vulnerable, he didn't know how to be, but Clara had made him feel something. She had made him forget the cold walls he'd built around himself. But it was too late. He had already been scarred. And just as he had started to think that maybe, just maybe, he could allow her in, her family had been caught up in a deal that went wrong, and Clara had been dragged into the crossfire. The betrayal had been complete. She wasn't taken by force. She left him, and the wounds she left behind were deeper than anything else he had ever known. After that, he had sworn off any softness, any connection. His walls grew thicker, and his heart colder. Vincenzo's fists clenched, the old ache rising again. He hadn't let himself feel that in years. His eyes shifted to the faint glow of the moonlight outside, his mind still racing with the past, but also something new, something that hadn't been there before, Isabella. It wasn't just the bond, it wasn't just the damn mark on her skin. It was the pull, the way her defiance ignited something inside him that he'd buried for so long. She reminded him of the ghosts in his past. She was everything he had sworn off. Vulnerable, untouchable, and yet, in her eyes he could see the same thing he saw in himself. A hunger for survival. But what scared him the most was the way she made him feel something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. A connection. Not just physical, but emotional. He hated it, hated her for it, and yet he couldn't seem to shake it. Vincenzo had spent his entire life building his empire, creating an identity that was immune to weakness. But the bond with Isabella had shaken that. It felt like a crack in the armor he'd spent years perfecting, and that terrified him more than anything else. He rubbed his hand across his face, trying to clear the fog in his mind. He couldn't afford to feel this way, he couldn't afford to care. His thoughts drifted to the present, back to the holding room, to the fire in Isabella's eyes. She had fought him from the moment they'd met. The defiance in her gaze, the way she'd rejected the bond, it was all he could think about. She wasn't like the women he knew. She wasn't a pawn in his world, she was a fighter. And damn it, she made him want to fight too. But not for control, no. She made him want to fight for her. And that was the problem. Vincenzo let out a breath, his chest tight with the weight of everything he couldn't escape. He turned away from the window, forcing his thoughts back into the present. He wasn't going to let this happen, not again. But something told him that trying to ignore it wouldn't work, because Isabella had already marked him, just as surely as that goddamn bond had. And for the first time in his life, he didn't know if that was a curse or a blessing. Isabella's steps were measured as she followed the guard through the hallway of Vincenzo's mansion, her mind running in 1,000 different directions. The place was pristine, too pristine, and she hated the polished, cold perfection of it. Everything about this world screamed control, and control was something she would never give up, no matter how tightly it gripped her now. They passed open doors that led to rooms she couldn't care less about, but the quiet murmur of voices inside sent a chill down her spine. She had entered a world where everything and everyone was a potential threat. The scent of expensive leather and wood, the dull gleam of chandeliers hanging from the ceilings, it all felt like a mask, one that hid the rot beneath. The guard stopped at a door, nodding at her, as though it meant something, as though she meant something. "This is your room," he said, voice devoid of warmth. He didn't wait for a response, just turned and walked off, leaving her to face the thick wooden door in front of her. My room. It was hard to comprehend. One moment she'd been fighting for her life in an alley, and the next she was being brought into the heart of the beast's den. She was here now, part of Vincenzo's world, whether she wanted it or not. She nodded, and she wasn't sure which part of it she hated more, the fact that she was stuck here, or the strange sense of inevitable that gnawed at her insides. Isabella stepped inside, her eyes taking in the luxurious furnishings, the soft velvet curtains, the gleaming mahogany furniture, the crisp scent of fresh flowers in a vase on the table. She hated it all. It was a world she'd never wanted to be a part of, a place where power was the currency, and people were disposable. The only things she saw here were chains, no matter how beautifully wrapped. She set her things down on the bed and turned to the window, staring out at the sprawling city below. The view was breathtaking, but it didn't hold her attention. Nothing held her attention anymore. Not since the mark, not since Vincenzo had branded her with a connection she neither wanted nor understood. "Stop overthinking," she muttered to herself, though the words did little to ease the tightness in her chest. She wasn't going to let this place change her. She wasn't going to let Vincenzo break her. She'd survived worse. She'd clawed her way out of hell and come out the other side stronger. This, whatever this was, would be no different. The following days passed in a blur. Meetings, more meetings, and always those damn eyes on her. Vincenzo's men, watching her every move. But the hardest part wasn't the constant surveillance. It was trying to fit in, trying to act like she belonged. She didn't, not here. Vincenzo had made it clear from the start that she was part of his organization, and that meant she had to obey. But Isabella wasn't a woman who took orders, not from anyone, not even him. She spent her days keeping to herself, observing, studying the men who served Vincenzo. They were all a little too polished for her liking, dressed in expensive suits and speaking in clipped tones that made it clear they were playing a game they'd been trained to win. But the longer she stayed here, the more she noticed the cracks in their armor. A look exchanged here, a whispered conversation there. It didn't take long for her to realize that loyalty in this world wasn't as simple as it seemed. People didn't trust each other, they just waited for the right moment to stab one another in the back. She was no different. So she started gathering information, the conversations she overheard, the things she saw when the doors opened for a split second. Everything was a piece of the puzzle. She would figure this out, use what she learned, and then she would leave. She just had to be patient. Vincenzo's office was where all the power lived. She could feel it the moment she stepped inside. The sleek modern furniture, the cold metal shelves, the way the room seemed to swallow her whole, everything about it screamed dominance. And he was the king of this world, the one who ruled it all with a firm hand and a sharp mind. Her body tensed as she entered, his presence pulling at her like gravity. Vincenzo was sitting behind his desk, eyes locked on some papers in front of him, the harsh light casting a shadow over his sharp features. For a second he didn't look up, and Isabella almost allowed herself a moment of peace. Then his voice cut through the silence, smooth and commanding. "Sit!" She didn't question it. She didn't need to. She took a seat across from him, her eyes lingering on him for a beat longer than she intended. His eyes met hers, dark, intense, and calculating. The tension in the air thickened, but he didn't speak. He never did, not unless it was necessary. There was a tension, too, in her own chest, something that crackled between them, an electricity she didn't understand. She had been avoiding him the best she could, but she couldn't avoid this. Couldn't avoid the way his presence seeped into her every thought. "You're here to learn," he said finally, his voice low, clipped. "And you'll do well to remember that. Don't think you're above this." "Above it?" she smirked, meeting his gaze with defiance. "I'm not here to kiss anyone's arse, Vincenzo." A flicker of something, amusement, passed through his eyes. It was gone so quickly that she almost thought she'd imagined it. But it was enough to send a rush of heat through her body. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes studying her, the silence stretching longer than she expected. "Then you'll be a problem," he said softly, his voice laced with something dangerous. "And I don't handle problems well." The threat was clear, but there was something else there, something that wasn't just business. She knew it, and somehow that only made it worse. Later that night, after a long day of pretending to fit into a world she didn't belong to, Isabella found herself in the back of the mansion, looking out at the darkened garden. She was alone, or so she thought, until she felt the shift in the air. Vincenzo appeared, his presence sudden and unmistakable. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, watching her. "What do you want?" she asked. Her tone sharp, but it didn't mask the unease creeping up her spine. He didn't move closer, just watched her, his eyes unreadable. "I'm giving you the chance to prove yourself," he said quietly. "You'll see what you're really made of soon enough." Isabella wanted to retort, to fight, but instead she bit back the words. Because deep down she knew that something about this game was changing. And she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. The game had just begun. The cold steel of the training room floor pressed through her shoes as Isabella squared off against Vincenzo, the soft hum of the lights above them creating a tense backdrop. She felt every muscle in her body coiled tight, the anticipation thick in the air between them. It wasn't the first time they'd clashed, verbally, physically, or otherwise, but today the stakes felt higher. This wasn't just another training session, not when Vincenzo's presence was suffocating, his eyes sharp and calculating as they tracked her every move. "Again," he said, his voice low and commanding. He wasn't even breaking a sweat as she adjusted her stance, preparing herself for another round of their sparring. She could feel the heat in her chest rising. The tension between them, thick and palpable, always lurked beneath the surface. She was this close to losing control every damn time. But she wasn't here to lose, not to him, not to anyone. She lunged forward, her movements quick, instinctive. She wasn't trained to fight like Vincenzo. She didn't have the calculated grace of his strikes, but she had speed and the sharp edge of a survivor. She jabbed, her elbow connecting with the side of his ribcage, but he was already moving, dodging, his body a blur as he twisted around her, catching her by the arm and throwing her against the padded wall. The air left her lungs in a sharp gasp, but she didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing it. She was up in a second, spinning, trying again, and again. "You're predictable," Vincenzo said, his voice still cold, but a flicker of something else. Amusement danced in his eyes. "Maybe I don't need to be unpredictable," Isabella shot back, breathless. "Maybe I just need to be faster than you." She darted forward again, but this time he was ready. He caught her wrist mid-swing, pulling her close, so close she could feel his breath against her cheek, the heat of his body enveloping her. "Speed won't save you if you don't learn to think ahead," he murmured into her ear. She froze, her heartbeat thudding in her chest, and despite every instinct screaming at her to break free, she didn't. She didn't want to. He wasn't touching her like he wanted something from her. His grip was firm, controlled, like he was teaching. But it didn't stop the tension between them, or the way his touch set her skin on fire. She could feel it in the way her breath caught, the way the space between them suddenly seemed too small. You want to survive in this world," Vincenzo continued, voice lower now, more personal. "You have to think 3 steps ahead. Anticipate. You think this is a game of speed, but it's not. It's a game of control." She finally jerked her arm free, shoving him back with more force than she meant to. She didn't want to need him, not like that, not like this. "I don't need your control. I'm not here to play your games." Vincenzo's eyes darkened, and for a brief moment the quiet tension between them shifted, becoming something else entirely, something sharp, hungry, and dangerous. But before she could read it, he broke the moment, his lips curling into a half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Then figure out your own game." His voice was softer now, but no less demanding. "And don't make the mistake of underestimating mine." The next day, after hours of training, Vincenzo found her sitting alone in a secluded corner of the mansion's courtyard. Her breath came in shallow, uneven gasps, but she wasn't showing the weakness she felt. She never did. It had been a rough session. Her body was sore from the physical exertion, but it wasn't the bruises that were bothering her. It was him. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was always watching her, that he was a step ahead in ways she couldn't figure out. She didn't want him to be. Isabella glanced up when he approached, but didn't move. He leaned against the stone pillar next to her, silent for a long moment before speaking. "You don't fight like the others," Vincenzo observed, his gaze steady on her. "You fight like someone who's had to survive, not someone trained to kill. You're not predictable because you think with instinct, not strategy, but that will get you killed." She met his gaze, her expression cool. "I'm alive, aren't I?" His lips twitched at the corner, just barely. Barely. He took a step closer, his gaze softening in a way that almost didn't make sense. For a second there was something more between them, something unspoken, an understanding. She was an outsider to this world, and yet he saw something in her, something he couldn't ignore. She looked away, focusing on the distant horizon. "I don't need your pity or your lessons." "Who said anything about pity?" His voice was surprisingly gentle, and for the first time she heard the weight behind it, the care. The change in his tone caught her off guard. She didn't know how to respond to that, so she didn't. Instead, she stayed silent, the steady rhythm of her breathing filling the space between them. Then, without warning, Vincenzo's voice softened, the edges of it rough, like he was peeling something from the inside that he wasn't ready to show. "You remind me of someone I once knew," he said, voice low. "Someone I failed to protect." Isabella stiffened, her gaze flickering to him. But he wasn't looking at her now. His focus was distant, lost somewhere in the past, the rawness in his voice pulling her in even though she fought it. She didn't respond at first, her heart suddenly heavier in her chest, unsure of what to make of his admission. She wasn't used to seeing him like this. So human, so vulnerable. It unsettled her more than anything. "Are you telling me this?" she asked quietly, her voice unguarded for the first time in what felt like forever. Vincenzo didn't look at her, his jaw tightening as if he was forcing the words out. "Because sometimes people slip through your fingers, and you don't realize what you've lost until it's too late." The weight of his words hung in the air, and for the first time, Isabella saw the cracks in his armor. It was fleeting, gone almost before she could grasp it, but for that one brief moment, he wasn't the Mafia boss or the cold, calculated man she'd been trained to fear. He was just him, someone who had loved and lost, just like her. It softened something inside her, something she didn't want to admit, but she wasn't ready to be tethered to him, not yet. Not in this world. So she stood, shaking off the moment before it could settle too deep. "I'm not your project, Vincenzo." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "You're not a project," he said softly. "But you could be something more." Her heart skipped, the words sticking with her as she walked away, leaving him standing in the courtyard, alone. The city felt alive with danger, the kind that slithered beneath the surface, hidden in plain sight. The tension was suffocating in Vincenzo's operations tonight. Something was off. Too many whispers in the dark, too many eyes on him. That's why he'd sent Isabella. He needed someone who could think outside the lines, someone who wouldn't hesitate when the stakes were high. Isabella was exactly what he needed, but he'd never admit it. She was standing in the shadows, just outside the warehouse, her mind working faster than the beating of her heart. The rival faction had made their move. Delicate, subtle, but she knew their game. She'd learned early on to read people, to hear the things they weren't saying, to see what they weren't showing. She adjusted the strap of her jacket, her fingers brushing the cold metal hidden beneath. It was too quiet. That's how she knew something was coming. It wasn't just a feeling, it was experience. She slipped inside the warehouse, moving like a shadow, soundless, her every sense alert to the slightest shift in the air. The men she'd come to stop were too confident in their operation, too sure that they had Vincenzo's network in their pocket. Not on her watch. Isabella had learned from the best, the streets. The subtlety of her movements, the way she blended into the background, was as natural as breathing. She saw the bomb planted just beneath a stack of crates, the unmistakable wires and explosives rigged to destroy the entire operation. She paused, her mind racing as she calculated her next move. She didn't have the luxury of time. Without hesitation, she stepped forward, using the skills that had kept her alive. Quick thinking, precise movements, and the knowledge of where to hit. A swift twist of her wrist, and the bomb was disabled, rendered useless without a trace of noise. Just as she finished, the door creaked open, and she flattened herself against the wall, blending back into the shadows. Two men walked in, unaware that their plans had just been thwarted. They muttered something about their deadline, about securing the shipment. Isabella barely held back a smirk. They had no idea what had just slipped from their fingers. She waited, watching, until they were gone. Only then did she allow herself to relax, just a little, as she walked out of the warehouse, the task completed without a hitch. The operation had been stopped, and Vincenzo's empire remained untouched thanks to her. Back at Vincenzo's compound, Isabella walked into the war room where a few of his trusted men were gathered. The atmosphere was tense. The men didn't look at her with disdain anymore, but with something different. Respect, maybe. She didn't need to ask. She could feel the shift. Vincenzo was at the head of the table, his eyes flicking up when she entered. There was something in his gaze, something that might have been approval, but she couldn't quite place it. It disappeared as quickly as it appeared. "Mission accomplished?" he asked, his voice cool, but there was an edge to it, like he was waiting for her to mess up. Isabella gave him a nod, her expression neutral. "The bomb's disarmed. They won't be a problem anymore." She expected the usual curt response from him, maybe a terse "good," before he moved on to the next thing. But instead he paused, his eyes lingering on her for a beat longer than necessary. "You've done well," he said, and it was the first time she'd heard him acknowledge her ability without a hint of condensation. She didn't say anything, but the faintest glimmer of satisfaction curled inside her. This was her world now. She wasn't just an outsider anymore. She was someone who could make a difference. Her difference. Later that evening, Vincenzo called her to join him for a private dinner. It wasn't an official meeting, but in his world everything had a purpose. Isabella knew better than to ask why. She didn't need to. She entered the private dining room, the long table bathed in soft ambient light. Vincenzo was already seated, his sharp features illuminated by the candlelight. He was studying her as she approached, as if he were trying to read something she wasn't saying. She took her seat, her gaze steady. "What's this about?" Vincenzo smirked slightly, his usual intensity softened in the quiet space. "I wanted to see how you'd handle success." She raised an eyebrow. "Success? You mean surviving your tests?" A slow chuckle rumbled in his chest, and for the first time the hardness in his face seemed to melt just a little. "Is that how you see it? A test?" She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "What else would I call it?" There was a pause between them, a moment where the usual coldness in his eyes flickered, replaced by something else. Not warmth, never warmth, but something human, something less controlled, more raw. Vincenzo's gaze didn't waver. "You've earned more than just my respect, Isabella. You've earned my attention." Her pulse quickened, but she didn't let it show. "I don't need your attention." He didn't respond right away, taking a slow sip from his glass of wine, his eyes locked onto hers, dark and unreadable. "Yes, you do. And I'm starting to think you'll need more than that before long." She shifted in her seat, her throat tight as she tried to keep the emotion from showing. His words, deliberate and calculating, were making her feel something she didn't want to feel, something dangerous. The silence stretched between them, thick and taut, until Vincenzo broke it with a soft exhale. "You can't fight what's inevitable," he said, his voice lower now, smoother, like it was an observation rather than a challenge. She swallowed, the tension in the air settling around them like a fog. Inevitable. The word stung, and she hated the way it felt like an invisible chain linking them together, even though she fought it with every ounce of her being. "I'm not like the others in your world, Vincenzo. I don't need your approval," she said, her tone firm, but even to her own ears it lacked conviction. "You need more than just approval to survive here," he said quietly, leaning forward. "You need power, and I can give you that." She met his gaze, the air between them charged. She wanted to push back, wanted to tell him that she didn't need him, didn't need anyone. But the look in his eyes, calculating yet something more, made her pause. She could feel the flicker of that connection again, the pull that neither of them could ignore, no matter how much they resisted. "I'm not your pawn," she said, but the words felt hollow even to her. Vincenzo's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "No, you're much more than that." The slow burn between them simmered, the attraction undeniable, despite her best efforts to fight it, and for a moment, in the quiet intensity of his gaze, Isabella wasn't sure which was more dangerous, the world they were both caught in, or the man who was slowly becoming a part of it. Isabella stood by the window of her private quarters, her gaze fixed on the city below. The neon lights cast a harsh glow, but she didn't care about the city anymore. She cared about the weight on her chest, the sense of impending doom that had been creeping up on her since the day she'd stepped into Vincenzo's world. She could feel the tension in the air, thick enough to choke her. It was like everything was building up to something, a shift, a crack. The knock on her door was sharp but not unexpected. She turned, bracing herself. She knew what was coming. "Miss, the lieutenant wants to speak with you." Her heart skipped a beat. Of course, the one person in the entire organization who had yet to warm up to her. Pietro, the man who had never liked her, the one who saw her as an outsider. Now she knew why. The meeting room was quiet, the low murmur of conversation dying down as she entered. Pietro sat at the table, his eyes narrowing as she took her seat across from him. The air between them was thick with something she couldn't quite place, but she wasn't here to play games. "Not any more. Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice steady. She could feel the walls around her starting to close in. Pietro smirked, leaning back in his chair with an air of smug superiority. "You've been getting awfully comfortable, haven't you? Climbing your way to the top." Her pulse quickened, but she kept her expression neutral. "What exactly are you implying?" "Oh, I'm not implying anything," he said, eyes glinting with something dark. "I'm just curious how someone like you made it so far. A girl with no real experience, no family, just a street rat playing dress-up in a world she doesn't belong in." Isabella's jaw tightened, but she didn't react. Not yet. She had learned long ago to control her emotions, to mask the rawness inside her. But Pietro wasn't done. "I've heard whispers," he continued, his voice lower now, more dangerous, "about your past, about where you really come from." He slid a manila envelope across the table. "I've got everything I need to ruin you." Her fingers clenched around the edge of the table, her mind racing. He dug into her past, into the parts of her life she'd fought so hard to escape. Her family, her struggles, the things she'd buried deep to survive in a world that saw her as nothing more than a tool. And now Pietro had it all. The bastard was playing a dangerous game. Later that day, the tension reached a boiling point. Isabella was summoned to a meeting, a high-stakes one, where Vincenzo was supposed to broker peace between his faction and a rival group. She could feel the eyes on her the moment she stepped into the room. She should have known. Pietro was there, his smug smile cutting through the room like a blade. He stood, holding the same manila envelope, and as he locked eyes with Isabella, a silent, malicious message passed between them. Before she could make a move, Pietro spoke. "Before we continue, there's something I think the room should know." He tossed the envelope onto the table, and all eyes followed. Isabella's chest tightened. Her skin went cold as the murmurs began. Her name was out there now. Her secrets. Her truth, about to be exposed. She had worked so hard to bury it, to become something more than what she'd come from. But there was no escaping it now. "I've done a little digging," Pietro said, his voice smug as it reverberated through the room. "And I've uncovered some interesting things about our dear Isabella. You know, she's not exactly the polished, well-bred woman she's been pretending to be." A few of the men exchanged glances. The room was silent, the weight of his words sinking in like a stone. Isabella could feel the room closing in on her, the walls of her carefully built world beginning to crack. "I know about her family," Pietro continued, his words cutting deeper with every syllable. "I know about the struggles she faced growing up, the dishonourable ways she made her way up the ladder." He smirked. "How far will you let someone like her climb before you see what she really is?" Her fists clenched beneath the table, and for a brief moment she wanted to scream. She wanted to lash out, to make him feel every ounce of the betrayal she was drowning in. But she couldn't. Not now. Not in front of all these men, who now saw her for the lie she'd been forced to live. It wasn't just Pietro's words that stung. It was the looks, the way everyone shifted uncomfortably, questioning her worth, her place in this world. She could feel the weight of their judgment, the same judgment she had fought all her life. Vincenzo's voice sliced through the tension. "Enough, Pietro!" His tone was cold, but it didn't touch the simmering anger in his eyes. "Leave." Pietro didn't move. He was enjoying this too much. "But Vincenzo, don't you think your precious Isabella should be held accountable for the lies she's been feeding you?" "Leave." Vincenzo's voice was like ice, but his gaze never left Isabella's. There was a flicker there, something she couldn't decipher. Pietro hesitated for a second, but then, with a spiteful smile, he left the room. Isabella didn't move. She couldn't. The weight of what had just happened was suffocating. Her world was unraveling, her identity in pieces. She wanted to leave. She wanted to run as far as she could, but the one person who could stop her was sitting across the room. Vincenzo's gaze softened, but only slightly. "This doesn't change anything." Her heart ached, the weight of his words heavier than she could bear. "Doesn't change anything?" But it had. It had changed everything. She swallowed, her voice barely a whisper. "You knew what I was from the start." "Not the whole story," he said quietly, standing up from his chair. His gaze lingered on her for a beat too long. "But it doesn't matter. You've earned your place here, Isabella. Don't let him tear that down." The words, meant to reassure her, felt hollow. She wasn't sure who was trying to convince whom, but when he stepped toward her, his presence engulfing her, she felt something else. A raw, dangerous promise, like he was telling her that no matter what happened, no matter how much she was torn apart, she wouldn't be alone. Not with him. And that scared her more than anything else. As he reached out, his fingers brushing against hers, the connection between them was undeniable. It wasn't just physical. It was something deeper, something neither of them could run from. But in this world, trust was a currency neither of them could afford. The room felt too small, the air too thick. Vincenzo's eyes never left Isabella as Pietro's words reverberated through the tense silence. Every eye in the room was on her now, and it wasn't just suspicion he saw in their stares. It was judgment. She had been exposed. The truth of her past laid bare in front of everyone, and Vincenzo? He couldn't breathe. Not because of the revelations. He had known, suspected much of it, but because seeing her like this, vulnerable, torn down, cut through him in ways he didn't want to acknowledge. His chest was tight, his fists clenched at his sides as his mind fought to sort through the mess of duty and something else. Something growing inside him that didn't have a place here, not in his world. He knew the rules. He had spent years upholding them. Trust is earned, loyalty is bought, and anyone who isn't useful is discarded. It was cold, brutal, but it was how things worked. But Isabella, she wasn't supposed to matter to him, not like this. She was nothing but a liability now, wasn't she? Vincenzo! Pietro's voice was sharp, pulling him back to the present. His smirk was infuriating, a clear sign that he'd just won whatever game he was playing. You're not going to do anything about this? Vincenzo didn't answer right away. He couldn't. His mind was a battlefield. He had his empire to protect, his loyalty to uphold, and this woman who had forced herself into his world, who had made herself indispensable in ways he couldn't even admit to himself, was now a liability. She was his problem now. His gaze shifted to Isabella. She stood there, her posture rigid, but the storm in her eyes was unmistakable. He could see the anger swirling inside her, the raw hurt, and the desperation not to show it. She didn't ask for this. He knew that. But that didn't change the fact that she was caught in the middle of a war she didn't belong in. God, she was strong. Too strong for him. For this. His eyes flickered to her hand, clenched into a fist at her side, and something twisted deep in his chest. I need to fix this. But how? She had built a fragile trust within his ranks, had earned respect she wasn't supposed to have. But now, with this betrayal laid bare, it would all fall apart. She wasn't just being humiliated by Pietro, she was being torn apart in front of him, and all he could do was stand there, paralyzed. Vincenzo, Pietro pressed, his voice rising, breaking through the thick tension. Do you want me to tell them who she really is? Enough. Vincenzo's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Enough, he repeated, his tone ice-cold. The room stilled, every set of eyes flicking toward him, waiting for him to make a decision. His fingers tightened into fists, the anger bubbling up inside him like molten lava. For a moment he thought he might snap. He might give in to the rage and take out the bastard in front of him. But he couldn't. The empire, his empire, Isabella. She had been exposed, and Vincenzo knew this moment could break her. He wasn't going to let that happen. With a sharp motion, Vincenzo stood, walking toward the head of the table, his every step deliberate, purposeful. His men and the rival factions all watched him, waiting, silent, as the tension thickened. "You'll not tear her apart," he said, his voice low and lethal. "No one here will. Understood?" Pietro opened his mouth to protest, but Vincenzo silenced him with a glare that made the room shudder. "Get out of my sight!" For a moment Pietro hesitated, then, with a muttered curse, he stalked out of the room, leaving the heavy silence in his wake. Vincenzo's eyes flickered back to Isabella, who hadn't moved. She was still standing, her back straight, eyes hard. She wasn't broken, not yet, but he knew the cracks were there, and he didn't want to be the one to let it all crumble. "I didn't ask for your protection," she said, her voice tight, but there was something else in it, something too raw for her to hide. She was fighting back the flood of emotion, trying to control it, trying to hide from the truth that had just been shoved into the open. "You don't need to ask," Vincenzo replied, his voice quiet but firm. He was beside her now, his presence filling the space between them. She looked at him for the first time, and the look in her eyes made his chest ache in a way he hadn't expected. Vincenzo's gaze softened, just a fraction, but the intensity between them didn't waver. "I am not letting you fall apart, Isabella. Not after everything you've done. I'm not letting you." She opened her mouth to respond, but he didn't give her the chance. Instead, he stepped closer, his hand reaching out to lightly touch the side of her face, his thumb brushing the line of her jaw. The simple touch was electric, intimate and painfully tender, like a promise he couldn't keep but wouldn't break. Her eyes flickered to his lips, her breath hitching, and for a heartbeat everything slowed. The world outside this room disappeared, the chaos fading into the background. It was just the two of them now, her and him, caught in something that neither of them understood. Her breath came faster, the air between them thick with something unspoken. And in that moment, Vincenzo felt it, the pull between them, undeniable and magnetic. But he couldn't let it get to him. Not now, not when everything was falling apart. His empire had always come first. His hand dropped, but his gaze never left hers. "You're not alone in this. I'm not leaving you." The rawness in her eyes softened, just a little, as if she didn't quite believe him. But the small crack in her defenses was enough to make his heart race. She didn't speak, but the weight of his words lingered, wrapping around them both like a thick fog. And as the tension in the room settled, Vincenzo knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened next, whatever the cost, he was done trying to bury the truth. He couldn't walk away from this, not anymore. Not when she had already become more to him than he could ever explain. Act soon, the fall. The chaos hit fast. Too fast. Vincenzo barely had time to process the betrayal before the first whispers began to spread like wildfire, eating through the edges of his empire. His trusted men turned on him, alliances fractured in an instant, and rival factions wasted no time in seizing the opportunity to chip away at his power. They were sharks in the water, circling, waiting for the first sign of weakness. The tension in the air was suffocating. Each decision Vincenzo made seemed to pull him deeper into a pit he couldn't escape. He could feel the world shifting beneath him. The empire he'd built for years, crumbling like dust, slipping through his fingers. Isabella's world was falling apart in the same way. She didn't know how long she had been hiding in the small, abandoned apartment Vincenzo had arranged for her. Long enough to lose track of time. Every passing minute felt like a weight on her chest, suffocating her. She wasn't just hiding from the men who had once seen her as an asset. She was hiding from herself. The woman she had fought so hard to become was slipping away, undone by one person's greed, one person's jealousy. Pietro. It was his betrayal that had shattered everything she'd worked for. The lie of respect, the lie of acceptance. She had never been fully a part of this world, not really. Not in the way they saw it, not in the way Vincenzo saw it. But then, why did she feel so lost? She paced the small room, her head spinning. The man she had trusted, the man who had seen something in her, something, had now left her here, isolated, alone. Not even his voice had reached her since everything fell apart. He had other things to worry about, and she couldn't blame him for it. She didn't know who she was anymore. The door creaked open. Her heart skipped a beat, but it was only a guard, his face stoic, unreadable. "Vincenzo sent me," he said quietly. "He wants you to stay here until things settle." Stay here. Hide. Isabella didn't respond. The weight of his words sinking in, suffocating her more than the silence. Vincenzo's office was empty, the usual hum of activity in his headquarters a distant echo. He hadn't left it in days, buried under the weight of decisions he couldn't undo. Every move he made felt like a misstep. The betrayal had torn everything to pieces, and the worst part, he couldn't figure out who to blame. Pietro? Himself? His eyes drifted to the liquor cabinet, the temptation too great. He hadn't wanted to drown his thoughts, but the alcohol offered a quiet escape from the storm raging inside him. He poured himself a glass, the amber liquid swirling in the glass as he stared at it. knowing it wouldn't bring any clarity. But it was the only thing that felt like a release. He drained the glass in one go. But it didn't numb the ache in his chest. It didn't change the fact that Isabella was out there, hiding in some small apartment while the world around them crumbled. He had let her down. And it hurt more than he ever thought possible. The rain was coming down hard now, hitting the windows of the mansion with a rhythmic thrum that matched the pulse in Vincenzo's head. He stood at the window, staring out at the dark, rainy night, his mind replaying every moment with Isabella, every word, every look. She had trusted him, and he had failed her. There was nothing left to salvage, nothing to fix the damage done. The knock on the door interrupted his spiraling thoughts. Without waiting for a response, the guard entered, his face shadowed, grim. Sir," the man said softly, "the rival factions are moving in. They're starting to take control of some of the lower territories." Vincenzo's grip tightened around the edge of the desk. "And the men?" "Some have already switched sides. A few remain loyal, but the damage is done. The Empire is breaking apart." This was his fault, every piece of it. Vincenzo slammed his fist against the desk, frustration and guilt mixing into something darker, something more dangerous. "I've fucked this up," he muttered under his breath. "Don't," the guard said, his voice quiet but firm. "It's not all lost yet. You still have time." Time? Time to fix what? He'd been so careful, so precise, but now everything was slipping away. And she was the only one who mattered. Isabella. He had let her in, and now she was drowning in the same storm he had created. Isabella sat in the dark, the rain tapping against the window, her thoughts as disjointed as the flashes of lightning illuminating the sky. She didn't know how much time had passed. It felt like a lifetime. Her phone buzzed on the table, cutting through the silence. She picked it up, her heart skipping when she saw the name flashing on the screen. Vincenzo. For a moment she froze, the uncertainty heavy in the pit of her stomach. Should she answer? Would it even matter? She pressed the green button, bringing the phone to her ear, her breath catching in her throat. "Isabella?" Vincenzo's voice came through, rough, raw. "You're safe?" The question hit her harder than she expected. She wasn't safe. Not really. She wasn't sure she ever had been. But she couldn't say that. She couldn't burden him further. "I'm fine," she said quietly, her voice betraying her more than she wanted. "Just waiting." There was a long pause before he spoke again, his voice low, full of regret. "I should have protected you. I should have seen this coming." Her chest tightened. She couldn't do this, not now, not when she was already crumbling. "Don't," she whispered, cutting him off. "Don't make it worse. I never wanted this for you. Not like this." She could hear the pain in his words, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to undo everything that had already been lost. "I don't know how to fix this, Isabella," he continued, "but I won't give up on you. I can't." Her breath hitched, the weight of his words like a punch to the gut. The world outside raged on, the storm crashing against the windows, but the silence between them was even louder. "I need you to hold on," he said, the words breaking slightly. "We're not done yet." Tears burned in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She wasn't sure she could trust him anymore. She wasn't sure she trusted herself. But in the quiet of the storm she whispered the only thing she could. "I'll try." The storm raged outside, but the silence inside felt like it would swallow her whole. Both of them, lost in their own separate storms, broken and afraid. And she knew then that nothing would ever be the same again. The wind howled through the trees, biting and sharp, as Isabella paced the length of the small cabin. It was too quiet here. The isolation was suffocating. But it was the only place Vincenzo thought she'd be safe for now, away from the chaos that had fractured everything, the betrayal, the aftermath, the men who were once loyal to him now circling, waiting for the first sign of weakness. But Isabella wasn't thinking about that right now, not fully. Her hands shook as she reached for the window, her eyes scanning the darkness outside. The moon was rising, full and bright, hanging heavy in the sky. It called to her, a pulse in her blood she couldn't ignore. She had felt it before, but now it was different, more urgent, more real. It was time. The change was coming. And she didn't know how much longer she could keep pretending it wasn't. The mark on her skin. It burned when she touched it, a reminder that there was no escape. No matter how hard she fought, no matter how many times she tried to push it all down, it was there. She was bound to him, bound to this world, the world that terrified her. Isabella exhaled sharply, turning away from the window. She was alone, so damn alone, and yet the pull to Vincenzo was undeniable. Even when she tried to shut it out, it gnawed at her, a part of her she couldn't shake. His face, his touch, those damn words he'd whispered to her in the heat of everything, they burned in her mind too, like a wildfire spreading through her veins. She wasn't supposed to care. She was supposed to be stronger than this. She wasn't supposed to let him into her world. But now, in the silence of the cabin with the moon rising higher, her thoughts betrayed her. She sank down onto the edge of the bed, her head in her hands as her breath quickened. What am I becoming? A howl echoed in the distance, the unmistakable sound of a wolf calling to the night, pulling her from her thoughts. She flinched, her heartbeat quickening. The wolf inside her, it was coming. The transformation wasn't just inevitable, it was necessary. And that scared her more than anything else. By the time the moon reached its peak, she was trembling. Her body felt like it was being pulled in two directions, her mind screaming for control, but her body betraying her. The energy surged inside her, raw and untamed, like a flood breaking through a dam. She could feel it in every fibre of her being, the shift, the change that was coming. It wasn't just physical. It was something deeper, something primal. The ache in her bones was like nothing she had ever felt before. She was losing control, and part of her wanted to scream, to run, to fight it with every ounce of her being. But there was another part of her, something darker, something wild, that whispered for her to let go, to embrace it. With each passing second, the pressure inside her built until it felt like it would tear her apart. The wolf wanted out. It wanted to claim her, to change her. She had resisted it long enough. She let out a shaky breath and closed her eyes, her body convulsing as she sank to the floor. The shift was coming and she couldn't stop it. Pain, agony. She felt her bones crack, her muscles stretch. Her skin burned with the transformation. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and she gripped the floor beneath her, nails digging into the wood as she fought to hold on. The world around her shifted. The sounds grew sharper, the air thicker, more vibrant. The moonlight flooded the room, casting everything in a silver glow. And then it happened. The shift was violent, primal, ripping through her like a force of nature. But as the change settled in, as the wolf inside her rose to the surface, something else rose too. Something unexpected. It wasn't just the wolf. It was the truth. She wasn't just resisting her fate anymore. She wasn't fighting what had been written for her. She was accepting it. A deep growl rumbled in her chest as her vision sharpened. The darkness now a symphony of smells, sounds, and sensations she couldn't have imagined before. Her body felt alive in ways it never had. And then, beneath the raw power, there was something else. A connection. The bond. The pull to Vincenzo. She could feel him, even now, even from miles away. It was as if the moon had bridged the distance between them, and the bond between them snapped into place. She wasn't just his mate. She was a part of him now. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut, but it didn't scare her. Not anymore. She could feel him in her chest, in her heart. The bond, the wolf, the man, they were all together now, inseparable, and somehow it made sense. This was the truth she had been denying. She had never been meant to fight this. She had been meant to embrace it. As the transformation settled, Isabella rose to her feet, feeling the power coursing through her, every inch of her body alive with energy she couldn't control. She was no longer the woman who had walked into this world full of doubts. She was the woman who had found her place in it, whether she liked it or not. The door to the cabin creaked open, and Isabella's eyes flashed to it, her senses on high alert. She knew who it was before he even stepped inside. Vincenzo. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a brief moment the world outside disappeared. They didn't speak, they didn't need to. The bond between them was louder than any words could be. It pulsed in the air, thick and undeniable, and in that moment, standing across from him, Isabella knew one thing. The wolf had claimed her, but so had he. The attraction was there, deep and fierce, and it was more than just physical. It was everything she had fought against, everything she had pushed down. The resistance, the fear, it all melted away under the weight of the moonlight, under the weight of the bond. She took a step toward him, her heart racing, and saw the flicker of surprise in his eyes. But there was something else there too, something that made her blood sing. He stepped toward her, slowly, deliberately, until he was close enough to reach out and touch her. His fingers brushed against her arm, sending a jolt of heat through her body. "You've changed," he murmured, his voice rough, and for the first time since she had stepped into his world, Isabella didn't hesitate. She didn't fight it, she didn't pull away. "I've embraced it," she whispered back, her voice low but filled with something unspoken, and as their bodies drew closer, the space between them vanished entirely, leaving only the truth of what they both were and what they would become together. Vincenzo didn't need the company of anyone. The moment the chaos had subsided, he'd retreated to the one place where the weight of his responsibilities felt less suffocating, the abandoned chapel hidden on the outskirts of his estate. The remnants of stained glass and worn wooden pews stood in stark contrast to the empire he ruled. The peace of the place offering something he'd almost forgotten existed. It was in the silence of that place, where nothing moved except the shadows cast by flickering candlelight, that Vincenzo could feel it all. The pressure, the guilt, the constant pull between his duty and her. He couldn't escape it, no matter how much he tried. Isabella, the woman he'd never wanted, but now couldn't get out of his mind. The bond between them was more than just an inconvenient tie. It was a chain, yes, but it was also a tether to something deeper, something real. He clenched his jaw, pacing through the abandoned hall, the echo of his steps filling the empty space. He couldn't decide whether it felt like a cage or a lifeline. She had changed everything. Had he allowed her to, or was it inevitable? Every touch, every moment of connection, every glance he'd shared with her made the weight of this impossible bond more crushing. A flash of her face appeared in his mind, her eyes fierce with defiance, but softened by something else. Something that had broken through all his defenses without him realizing. She had always been a force. His fingers tightened into fists, and he stopped at the altar, running his hands along the cool stone. He could still hear her words in his head, her voice cutting through the storm they'd faced together. "You're not my project." She had said that with such conviction, her rejection of him in that moment echoing in his bones. But now everything was different. The full moon had come and gone, and with it she had fully embraced what he had feared for so long. She had embraced them. Vincenzo closed his eyes, feeling the weight of everything. The betrayal, the growing tension in his empire, and the undeniable pull to the woman he couldn't stop thinking about. His entire life had been built on cold logic, on controlling the chaos around him, but now he didn't know where the line was between his duty and something else, something raw and dangerous. His fingers tightened on the stone, and he opened his eyes, staring at the empty space in front of him, as if he could see her there. He remembered the first time they'd met. Her anger, her defiance, the way she'd fought him every step of the way. And yet, despite everything, she had become more to him. He exhaled slowly, the pain of their reality weighing on him. The bond between them was both a blessing and a curse. He couldn't change it. He couldn't run from it. But there was something inside him that knew. Maybe this wasn't just about survival anymore. Maybe it was about something deeper. The memories flooded in then. Scattered moments that painted a clearer picture than he'd ever realized. Isabella, standing tall in the face of his empire, defying him at every turn. The way her eyes had softened that one time, just before they'd clashed again. The way she stood her ground even when the world around her was falling apart. Vincenzo's jaw clenched harder. She didn't need him. She never had. And yet there she was, drawn into this world because of him. Because of this. The bond. His thoughts drifted back to the many nights spent alone. The quiet moments where he had pondered whether any of this was worth it, whether a life of power, violence and control would ever be enough to fill the emptiness in his chest. Was it her, he wondered? Or was it this world? The moonlight through the broken windows painted shadows across the room, and Vincenzo's thoughts shifted to a time before all of this, before the betrayals and the war, before he'd built this empire on blood and loyalty. There had been a time, long ago, when he had dreamed of a different life, a life where he didn't have to hide behind walls, where he didn't have to mask his emotions with control. The thought was fleeting, but it lingered like a whisper he couldn't ignore. Back at the cabin, Isabella stood by the window, staring into the night. The bond still pulsed beneath her skin, like a constant heartbeat, always there. She could feel Vincenzo now more than ever, the invisible thread between them tightening with each passing hour. Her body felt the pull. Her heart, too. She couldn't deny it. She couldn't outrun it. She could feel him, even from here, could feel the weight of his thoughts, the storm inside him as he grappled with the same questions she had been asking herself. Was this what they were now? Bound by something that neither of them had chosen, but that neither could escape. The transformation had only been the beginning. The change inside her had started long before that, long before the mark had branded her. It wasn't just the wolf inside her that was growing, it was the connection, the raw, undeniable force between her and Vincenzo. She couldn't escape it, she didn't even want to, but there was still so much she didn't understand. So much she couldn't control. Her fingers brushed the edge of the window as she gazed out into the night. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees, and she thought for a moment that it carried his presence with it. She swallowed hard. She wasn't ready to admit it, but the truth was undeniable. She needed him, and no matter how much she fought it, no matter how much she hated the way he made her feel, she couldn't shut it out. The bond, the pull. It was stronger than anything they had ever faced before, and just like him, she couldn't stop herself from embracing it. Vincenzo's chest tightened as he left the chapel, the weight of everything pressing down on him, but for the first time, a strange calm settled in. The decisions ahead wouldn't be easy, and there was no guarantee they would survive the chaos that awaited them. But as he stepped into the cold night, the howling wind cutting through the silence, he knew one thing with brutal clarity. The Empire wasn't the only thing he was willing to protect anymore. Isabella was his now, just as much as he was hers, and whatever it took, he would find a way to make it work, to make them work, for better or worse. Was no longer just about control. It was about trust, about embracing what they had together, whether it destroyed him or not. And for the first time in a long time, Vincenzo didn't feel quite so alone. The night had never felt so alive. Isabella stood at the edge of the balcony, the cool wind whipping through her hair, her eyes scanning the city below. It felt different now. Not just the view, but the way she stood. Feet planted firm, shoulders squared. The girl who had once hidden in the shadows, afraid of what she could become, was gone. In her place stood someone who had finally accepted what she was, what they were. and it had changed everything. The werewolf inside her no longer felt like a curse, it felt like power. She exhaled slowly, her breath sharp in the night air, and she could feel it, the strength within her thrumming like a heartbeat that belonged to her and no one else. The bond with Vincenzo was there, stronger than ever. But she wasn't just his anymore, she was hers, and for the first time the idea of owning herself didn't terrify her. No, it empowered her. Training had become more than a physical exercise. It was her rebirth. Each movement, each strike was a way to solidify her place in this world, not just as a player, but as a leader. Vincenzo's world was hers now, too. She could feel the shift. She wasn't just earning respect from the men who had once dismissed her. She was taking it. She took down enemies, men who thought they could use her, belittle her, and in every battle, in every calculated decision, she was reminding them she was not a puppet. She was the one pulling the strings now. And when the next test came, a rival faction trying to sabotage one of Vincenzo's major shipments, Isabella didn't hesitate. She took charge, her plans laid out with precision, her movements sharp and decisive. The operation was destroyed before the rival men even knew they'd been played. Her message was clear: "Don't underestimate me again." Vincenzo's eyes followed her, quietly admiring her strength, the way she commanded the room with barely a word. His respect for her had never wavered. But now it was something more, something unspoken between them. She had come into his world as an outsider, but now she was a force in her own right. He watched her as she approached the table, her eyes scanning the map laid out before them, her hands smoothing over the lines of their operation. She was more than capable, more than the fierce woman who fought alongside him. She was a partner. And as much as it stung to admit it, Vincenzo knew the truth. He wasn't just protecting her anymore, he was relying on her. "You've earned the respect of the men," one of Vincenzo's top men said as he entered, nodding toward Isabella. "They listen to you now. They follow." Isabella's lips twitched at the compliment, but she didn't smile. Not yet. The real work was just beginning. "They don't follow because of my charm," she said, her voice low and confident. "They follow because I show them what happens when they cross me." The men who had once doubted her now sought her counsel. Some were wary, still unsure of the force she'd become, but she didn't need their trust immediately. She only needed them to know she wasn't a liability. She was an asset. Vincenzo leaned against the wall, watching her work, his thoughts tangled. He couldn't deny the way she made him feel. There was a connection, undeniable and strong, even in the moments when they weren't speaking. She wasn't just the woman who had forced her way into his empire. She was the woman who could tear it down and rebuild it. Together. The realization hit him harder than he expected, the weight of it pressing down on him. He could never let her go, not now. Not when she had become everything to him. And yet, his fingers tightened around the edge of the desk as he thought about the empire he had built, the mistakes, the betrayals, the bloodshed that had come with every decision. But if there was one thing he had learned from her, it was this. He couldn't keep living in the past. Not with her. Not with the future they could build. That night, Vincenzo called a meeting. His men gathered in the war room, the familiar tension in the air thick with anticipation. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Things are changing," he said, his voice steady, his eyes locking on to each of his men. "And so is the way we do business." There were murmurs in the room. He knew this wouldn't be easy, not after everything that had happened, but it was time for the old ways to end. "We've been operating on fear for too long. Loyalty through intimidation, that ends now." Vincenzo's voice was sharper, harder than it had ever been. "From now on, this organization will stand on integrity, trust, and those who don't fit that will be dealt with." Isabella stood beside him, her presence unwavering. She was part of this now, The bond between them was unspoken, but it was there. They were united not just by the bond, but by a shared vision for the future. "I know many of you have doubts," Vincenzo continued, his gaze sweeping over the men in front of him. "You've been in this world long enough to know that loyalty isn't earned by kindness, but it's earned by showing respect, by showing that you can trust your leader." His eyes moved to Isabella, and for a brief second the hardness in his gaze softened. "And I trust her," he said, his voice firm. "I trust her to help lead this organization into a new era." The room went silent, but instead of the resistance he expected, there was a shift. It was subtle at first, a slight nod here, a glance there, but it was enough. Vincenzo knew he had their attention. It wasn't just his leadership that was solidifying this time, it was Isabella's strength, her quiet but undeniable power that was turning the tide. Later that night, as the weight of the decision settled in, Vincenzo found her in the quiet of the office, her back turned, as she reviewed the notes on the table. He approached silently, his footsteps soft, but his presence undeniable. "You did it," he said quietly, his voice raw with an emotion he wasn't ready to name. "You've made them believe in you." Isabella didn't turn, but he could hear the smile in her voice. "I didn't make them believe, I showed them. And you should know I didn't do it for you." For a second his heart stilled, the words hanging between them. "Then why?" he asked, his voice low. She finally turned, her gaze meeting his. "Because I want this. I want to make something better than what it was." Her words cut through him, raw and simple, and for the first time he saw it, their shared vision, their shared purpose. "You're not alone in this," he whispered, stepping closer, the air between them thick with everything they hadn't said. And for a moment everything else faded into the background. It was just the two of them now, standing in the ruins of the past, building something new, something stronger, together. Isabella took a step toward him, her fingers brushing against his arm as she closed the distance. There was no more hesitation, no more doubt. The kiss came naturally, slowly, but with more fire than either of them had ever expected. And in that moment, Vincenzo knew, whatever the future held, whatever challenges they would face them together. And nothing at all, could break what they had built. The moon hung low in the sky, casting its eerie glow across the city. But inside the dimly lit war room the atmosphere was anything but peaceful. The scent of cigar smoke lingered, the low hum of hushed voices filling the space as the room's occupants stood in quiet tension. It wasn't just a meeting, it was the beginning of something new. Isabella leaned against the wall, arms crossed, eyes sharp as she scanned the room. She could feel the weight of their stares. Some uncertain, others calculating, but no longer dismissive. Not since that night. Since the betrayal. Since she'd shown them who she was, who they could become if they followed her lead. Vincenzo stood across the room, his back to the wall, his eyes never leaving her. It was a look she'd come to expect, but now it felt different, less commanding, more approving. She wasn't just in this world anymore, she was shaping it, and he was standing beside her, not behind her, beside her. The door creaked open, and one by one Vincenzo's most trusted men filed in, each one nodding at her with a silent acknowledgement of her place in this game. This was it, the moment they all had been waiting for. The plan they had worked on, piece by piece, was finally coming together. "We're ready," Vincenzo said, his voice low but certain. Isabella didn't look at him, but she felt the way the words settled between them, thick with promise. They were more than just allies now, they were a team. And this moment? This was the turning point. She stepped forward, her movements confident. The time for playing it safe is over. We take back what's ours, piece by piece. We make sure the old order knows there's a new king and queen in town. A murmur of approval passed through the room, but no one dared speak over her. She was commanding them now. Her words had weight. "We're going to start by hitting them where it hurts," she continued, her gaze flicking over to Vincenzo as if to make sure he was with her. The subtle tension in the air shifted to something more palpable. We neutralize their assets, expose their weaknesses, and remind them who they're dealing with. Vincenzo's lips twitched slightly, as if impressed by the decisiveness in her tone. She hadn't expected anything less. But the truth was, this was more than just business. This was personal. And she could see it in the way Vincenzo watched her, how the weight of their shared history hummed between them. Intimate, charged, and undeniably powerful. He had always been about control. But with her, he was starting to let go of it, bit by bit. The meetings continued late into the night. Strategy after strategy was devised, alliances reaffirmed, and old wounds began to heal as they faced their enemies together. Every plan they made, every move they prepared was a reflection of the change that was rippling through their world. The old ways were fading, a new order was rising, and they were leading it. Together. But it wasn't just the men in the room that needed to be convinced. It was the world outside that would need to see the strength in their unity. Isabella's thoughts shifted as she looked across the table to Vincenzo, his jaw tight, his brow furrowed with concentration. He was so used to being the one who carried the weight of the empire on his shoulders, the one who made the decisions. But now he was trusting her, and that trust was becoming the foundation for what they were building. She leaned in, breaking the silence. Tomorrow we make a public statement, not with words, but with action. We show them that we don't just talk about change. We make it happen. Vincenzo's gaze flicked to hers, the intensity of his eyes making her heart race. I agree. It's time they see the new order in full force. The night of the ritual arrived quietly, the full moon once again casting its glow over the land, but this time there was no fear. There was only power. Power in the transformation, power in the bond, power in the unity they had forged. Vincenzo stood beside Isabella as she prepared herself for the ceremony. She had agreed to it, understood its significance. This wasn't just about embracing her place in his world, it was about the world embracing her. The courtyard was lined with members of their organization, the flickering light from torches casting long shadows on the stone walls. The air was thick with anticipation. This wasn't just a celebration, it was a declaration. Isabella took a deep breath, her heart steady, her mind sharp. She had nothing to fear. Not anymore. The power of the wolf pulsed beneath her skin, but it wasn't just the wolf she was embracing, it was everything that came with it. The strength, the confidence, the truth of who she was. And with it came the acceptance that she and Vincenzo were no longer just two forces colliding. They were one. Are you ready? Vincenzo's voice was low, a quiet question that sent a jolt of heat through her. Isabella's gaze met his, and she could see the way the moonlight caught the edges of his face, highlighting the raw emotion in his eyes. Emotion he usually kept buried, but now she could see it, and for the first time, it didn't scare her. I was born ready, she whispered back, her voice steady, even as the weight of the moment pressed on her chest. Vincenzo nodded, his hand brushing briefly against hers before stepping back, giving her space. The circle of people around them fell silent as the ritual began. A subtle shift in the air as the familiar chants began, echoing off the stone. It wasn't just the bond being marked tonight. It was her place in this world, her rise from the ashes of who she had been. And when she stepped forward, facing the gathered crowd, her voice rang clear through the night, unwavering. This is our new order, she declared, her eyes sweeping across the men who had once doubted her. And I'm not just a part of it. I lead it. The crowd stirred, and for a moment everything seemed to hang in the balance. But then, one by one, the men nodded. The respect, the acknowledgement was there. She had earned it. When she turned to Vincenzo, she saw something in his eyes that made her heart race. It wasn't just admiration. It was something deeper, something more personal. He stepped closer, his voice low, his lips brushing against her ear as he spoke just loud enough for her to hear. "You've earned more than just their respect," he murmured. "You've earned mine, and you've earned your place beside me." His words, low and intimate, sent a jolt through her, making her pulse spike with a mixture of desire and satisfaction. They weren't just allies anymore. They weren't just a team. They were something much more than that, something that no one could tear apart. And as the crowd erupted in approval, Isabella knew, deep in her bones, that this was only the beginning. Together they had forged a new empire, and nothing was going to stand in their way. The room was thick with tension. Even the air seemed heavy, as if the weight of the decisions they were about to make hung in the balance. The war room was filled with the low hum of activity, maps spread out, faces grim, as each loyalist member took their place. No more second chances. No more games. This was the moment they had all been preparing for, and Isabella could feel every heartbeat like a drumbeat in her chest. She wasn't nervous, not anymore. The transformation had solidified everything inside her. The woman she had been was gone, and the one standing here now, she wasn't just a player, she was the game. Vincenzo was at the center of it all, his face as cold and hard as always, but there was something in his eyes tonight. A quiet, steady trust in her that made her stomach tighten with something that wasn't fear, but the kind of resolve that came from acceptance. She wasn't here just to stand beside him. She was here to take back everything that had been stolen. "You've got a plan, right?" she said, her voice cutting through the buzz of the room. Vincenza looked up, meeting her eyes across the table. There was no smile, no reassuring words, just that steady, unwavering gaze. "Of course I do. But plans are only as good as the people executing them." His words hit harder than expected, a reminder that this wasn't just about strategy, it was about survival. "Do you trust them?" Isabella asked, gesturing to the room full of their men who were moving in preparation. She knew what was at stake. The price of failure was something neither of them could afford to face. Vincenzo's lips twitched, but the smile never quite formed. "I trust them to follow orders. If they fail, it won't be for lack of effort." That was all she needed to hear. There was nothing more to say. The next few hours would determine everything. The preparations were swift and ruthless. Orders were issued, weapons checked, and the last-minute adjustments were made, but it wasn't the tactical movements that worried Isabella, it was the unknown, the fact that betrayal could come from any direction. She stood on the edge of the compound, her eyes scanning the horizon as Vincenzo walked beside her. The cold night air whipped through her hair, and she turned her face to the sky, feeling the pull of the moon in her blood, the wolf inside her pushing at the surface. She was ready. He stopped beside her, his presence like a rock anchoring her in place. For a second the weight of everything they had fought for, hung in the space between them. "You've come a long way," Vincenzo said softly, his voice low but filled with something unspoken. She met his gaze, the quiet moment stretching between them, and the intensity of what they had become, a force, together, settled over her like a second skin. "So love you?" For a moment neither of them moved, as if they were both waiting for something. But then he stepped forward, his fingers brushing lightly against hers, sending a shock of heat through her body. "Let's finish this," he murmured, and without another word he turned and walked toward the rest of the men. The battle was swift, the sound of gunfire and snarls mixing with the adrenaline that surged through Isabella's veins. She was a whirlwind of controlled chaos, her newly awakened werewolf abilities cutting through the battlefield with lethal precision. She was faster, stronger, more dangerous than she had ever been. And with every blow, every movement, she was proving just how far she'd come. Beside her, Vincenzo was a blur of deadly grace, his martial prowess and Mafia cunning a perfect match for the brutality of the fight. His eyes locked onto hers for a brief moment across the chaos, a flash of something in his gaze that made her heart race in a way she couldn't ignore. But there was no time for thoughts. There was only the fight. She was in the thick of it now, taking down enemies left and right with a combination of werewolf speed and calculated strikes. The power surged through her, but it wasn't just the wolf. It was everything. The bond between them, the way they fought side by side, the way they had become unstoppable. A gunshot rang out, and she turned just in time to see one of their men go down, blood spilling onto the ground. Her heart stopped for a beat, but there was no hesitation. She was already moving, a blur of motion, taking down the man responsible before they could even blink. "Stay focused." Vincenzo's voice came through her earpiece, low and steady. She could hear the strain in his voice. He was feeling it too. The weight of leadership, the fear of failure. "I'm good," she replied, her voice clipped but sharp with intent. The battle raged on, and in the midst of it, a figure appeared. One of their own, a traitor from within, working with the rival faction. Isabella's eyes locked onto him, and her body moved instinctively. She was already on him before he could react, her claws extended as she swiped at him with a ferocity that left no room for mercy. The fight ended in seconds, his blood staining her hands as she stood over him, breathing heavily, every inch of her body alive with the aftermath of the kill. But just when it seemed like they had the upper hand, an explosion rocked the ground beneath them, sending debris flying and knocking them both off balance. Isabella hit the ground hard, the world spinning as pain lanced through her body. Her vision blurred, but she didn't need it to know what was happening. The rival forces were making a final push. The battle wasn't over. Vincenzo was at her side in an instant, his hand gripping hers, pulling her to her feet. His eyes were fierce, but there was something in his gaze, something unspoken, that made her chest tighten. "Don't do that again," he muttered, his voice rough, but there was no time to argue. They weren't done yet. Together they moved like a unit, coordinated, relentless, unstoppable. They fought side by side, their bond guiding them, pushing them, making them better. There was no room for doubt, no room for fear. As the last of their enemies fell, silence settled over the battlefield. The stench of blood and gunpowder hung in the air, but the war was over. For now, at least. Isabella turned to Vincenzo, her breath coming in heavy gasps, her body still thrumming with energy, but she saw it in his eyes. The relief, the victory, but beneath it there was something else, something deeper. They had survived, together, and the fight wasn't over yet. But they were ready. The night was silent for a heartbeat, a brief, breathless pause before the storm. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. Isabella could feel it in her bones. The last battle was about to unfold, and it wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about proving that they belonged here, that this new order they had fought for was more than just a fleeting dream. Beside her, Vincenzo was a force of calm, his presence steady and unwavering. His hand brushed against hers briefly, his fingers wrapping around hers for just a moment, a simple touch, but one that sent heat through her veins. Their connection was electric, undeniable. She had once thought that such intimacy was a weakness. Now she knew better. It was their strength. "This is it," Vincenzo murmured, his voice low and rough, his eyes locked onto hers with a fire that matched the one burning in her chest. "We finish this together." Isabella nodded, her breath steady but her heart pounding in her chest. Together. They moved as one, stepping into the heart of the compound, the shadows deepening around them. They weren't just fighting for power anymore. They were fighting for each other. The mastermind behind the betrayal, Roland Vasseur, was waiting for them, the man who had played them all like pawns. The man who had thought he could tear them apart. But what he didn't understand was this. They were no longer the same people they had been when he'd started this game. They had changed. And they weren't going down without a fight. The final confrontation was nothing like the battles they had fought before. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional. A clash of ideologies, of trust betrayed, of power fought for and earned. Isabella and Vincenzo moved through the compound, each step calculated, but every movement fueled by the bond between them. It was a silent agreement, an unspoken promise that they were in this together, no matter what. Roland was waiting in the center of the room, the flickering light casting sharp shadows across his face. He wasn't alone, but his lackeys weren't the problem. It was him, the man who had orchestrated everything. Isabella's eyes locked onto him, the rage building inside her, but there was something else, too, a quiet, deep knowing that this was the moment where everything would come together. "You think you've won?" Roland sneered, his voice dripping with contempt as he straightened. "But you're still playing in my world." "No!" Vincenzo's voice cut through the tension, calm but deadly. "You're in ours now." The words hung in the air, and for a moment everything stilled. Then, without warning, the fight erupted. Isabella moved like a blur, her werewolf abilities coming to life in a way that felt instinctual, seamless. She tore through the air, her body a lethal weapon as she took down Roland's men one by one. Each movement was swift, decisive, and everything she had learned, everything she had fought for, came together in this moment. But she wasn't just fighting the men. She was fighting him, Roland. Vincenzo was beside her, his presence like a shield. His sharp instincts, his precision, were a deadly combination, and they moved together like a unit, each strike calculated, each maneuver in sync. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. This was the culmination of everything they had built together. Isabella felt the power of the bond thrumming between them, as if it was guiding them. Every time she faltered, every time the enemy seemed to gain the upper hand, Vincenzo was there, and every time he seemed to waver, she was right by his side. They weren't just allies anymore, they were unbeatable. The fight raged on, intense and brutal, but it wasn't long before Roland realized his underestimation of them had been his downfall. His men were falling, and he was alone. It was clear in his eyes now, the doubt, the fear. Isabella's heart pounded as she faced him, her fists clenched, her breath coming in shallow bursts. "You thought you could tear us apart," she spat, her voice fierce, every word carrying the weight of everything they had been through. "But you didn't count on one thing. We are stronger together." Roland's eyes flicked to Vincenzo, then back to her, his lip curling into a sneer. "You really think you've won? That this pathetic alliance can stand up against everything I've built?" Vincenzo stepped forward, his gaze locked on Roland, cold and implacable. "You've built nothing. What you've created is a house of cards, and we're the wind that's blowing it down." The final strike came in a blur. Isabella's claws slashed through the air, her movements fueled by pure instinct, and Roland crumpled to the ground, defeated. It wasn't a victory, it was a declaration. The empire was theirs. In the aftermath, as the adrenaline faded, Isabella stood over the wreckage of their enemies. Her body ached, but there was something else that pulsed within her, something deeper, something more powerful than just survival. She turned to Vincenzo, her eyes locking with his, the weight of everything between them. He stepped closer, his presence like a shield. But it was more than that now. It was a partnership, a bond forged in the fires of battle. "You did it," he whispered, his voice rough with the raw emotion of the moment. His eyes were dark, intense, and for a moment they were both still, standing in the quiet aftermath of the storm. "No," she said softly, a small smile tugging at her lips. "We did it." And in that moment, standing side by side, facing the future they had earned, Isabella knew that nothing and no one could tear them apart. Together they had built this empire. Together they would rule it, and nothing at all, could take that away from them. The air smelled like victory, but it was tinged with the scent of blood and the weight of everything they had just survived. The battlefield lay in ruins behind them, bodies of their fallen enemies, the destruction of old alliances. But for the first time the weight didn't crush Isabella. It was the weight of something else now. The new beginning. She stood beside Vincenzo, looking out at the city below. The faint glow of dawn kissed the horizon, the light shimmering against the remnants of the old order. She could almost see it, The empire that was no longer a house of cards, but a foundation for something real, something lasting. "You know," she murmured, her voice quieter than usual, "I always thought I'd be the one left standing alone at the end of all this." Vincenzo's gaze flicked to her, the familiar intensity in his eyes softening just slightly. The silence stretched between them, comfortable but full of meaning. "Not this time," he said, his voice low and steady. "Not with me." The simple words hit harder than they should have. She felt a flicker of something in her chest, which she hadn't been ready to name. A connection, a promise. The battle had taken everything from them, trust, strength, even their fear. But what it had given back was more than they ever could have imagined. They were no longer just partners in survival. They had become something more, equals. She met his gaze fully now, her heart pounding louder than it had ever before. "So, we rebuild this empire together, for real this time. Not with fear, not with betrayal, with something better." He nodded, his lips quirking up at the edges, but it was the weight of his gaze that made her breath hitch. "You're the one who's shown me that," he murmured. "All this time I thought power was what kept everything together, but you've made me realize it's trust. It's us." Her pulse quickened at the way he looked at her now, no longer just the cold, calculating Mafia boss. There was something else there, something deeper, something that had always been there, buried beneath all the layers they had built around themselves. The words weren't spoken, they didn't need to be. They had never been enemies, not really. They had only been two people thrust into a world that had tried to break them both. But they were different now. They were stronger, and they were together. Hours later, the sun had fully risen, casting a golden hue over the newly rebuilt headquarters. The scars of the battle were still visible, but the building stood tall, a symbol of everything they had fought for. Vincenzo and Isabella stood at the top of the stairs, the wind picking up around them, the air fresh and clear. The world stretched out before them, and for the first time the future didn't feel uncertain. It felt like theirs. Vincenzo turned to her, his eyes locked on hers. There was no fear in his gaze, no uncertainty, only a quiet, undeniable strength that matched her own. "This is where it starts," he said, his voice soft but filled with the weight of everything they had built. Isabella stepped closer to him, her hand finding his, their fingers intertwining like they had always belonged together. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice steady, though there was something in her chest that felt new, tender. "Now. Not ever." He squeezed her hand, his touch grounding her in a way she didn't quite understand, but that felt so right. "This. Us. This is my choice, and it's not something I'll ever walk away from." For a second there was nothing but the quiet hum of the city around them. Just the two of them, standing there, knowing that the old world was behind them and the new one was theirs to shape. But it wasn't just about the empire or the power or even the legacy they would leave behind. It was about them. The battle had forged them together. The bond between them wasn't just something that would bind them to the empire, it was something that would hold them together forever. And in that moment, everything fell into place. The wind tugged at her hair as she looked up at Vincenzo. The uncertainty she had felt before, the fear of giving herself to him completely, had faded with every passing second. "I'm not afraid any more," she whispered, her voice barely above her breath. He smiled, the curve of his lips slow, deliberate. He leaned in, his forehead brushing against hers. "Neither am I." There was no grand declaration, no grand gesture, just the quiet understanding that they had both been waiting for this moment. For the moment when they could finally, completely choose each other. And as Vincenzo's lips brushed against hers, slow and tender, there was no hesitation, no fear, just the feeling of finally being home. The kiss deepened, the connection between them becoming a physical thing, tangible and undeniable. They didn't need words anymore. The way their bodies pressed together, the way their hearts beat in time, told them everything they needed to know. When they finally broke apart, breathless, Vincenzo rested his forehead against hers. "We're just getting started," he murmured, his words low, raw, and filled with promise. "This is our world now, together?" Isabella smiled, her heart full, her soul connected to his in a way that no one and nothing could ever take from them. Together they would rebuild, not just the empire, but their future. One built on trust, loyalty, and a love that had survived everything. And in that moment she knew it was true. Destiny had finally claimed them both. The city pulsed with a new energy, a quiet hum of change that started with the smallest, seemingly insignificant shifts and rippled outward. Isabella stood at the edge of the window in the newly renovated headquarters. The skyline stretched out before her like an unfinished canvas. It was different now. The shadows that once lurked in the corners of the empire had been purged, and what stood in their place was something better. The world she had entered with suspicion, with hesitation, was now hers, and hers with Vincenzo, standing beside her, not as a reluctant partner, but as someone who had truly earned his place at her side. The organization had shifted, like tectonic plates adjusting after years of pressure. No longer did the corrupt factions rule from the shadows. The men and women who had once conspired against them were gone, replaced by those who shared the vision they had built. Isabella walked through the halls of the headquarters, her strides purposeful, and she could feel it. The air was different. There were no whispers, no eyes watching from the corners, no uncertainty. The men who passed her now nodded in respect, a subtle shift from the doubt they had once held. But more than that, it wasn't fear that held them. It was loyalty. They trusted her, they respected her. The first successful shipment of resources under the new order was a triumph. Not just because it was executed flawlessly, but because the alliances they had built weren't rooted in fear or intimidation, they were built on integrity. Isabella had made sure of that. The same ruthless efficiency she had learned to wield was now tempered with empathy, with a respect for life that hadn't been there before. The balance had shifted, and she was at the center of it. Vincenzo, ever the calculating mastermind, had stood back long enough to let her lead, and now as they made their way through the city's underworld together, there was a harmony between them. Where he had once been the cold, ruthless king, now there was a warmth to him, a flicker of something human beneath the armor, and the men who followed him, who had once only feared him, now looked to him with admiration. They had become something greater than they had ever imagined. Together, the days passed in a blur of meetings, planning, and growing respect. The reformation wasn't just about power. It was about rewriting the very foundation of what they had built, what they had become. Isabella had her moments of doubt, moments when the weight of it all threatened to break her. But then Vincenzo would be there. Quiet, steady, his presence like a rock beneath her feet. He had been the one to teach her that there was more to leadership than just strength. There was heart, too, and now his was on full display. He smiled more, laughed more. It wasn't often, but when it came, it was real. She'd made him human, and that terrified her more than any enemy. One night they stood on the balcony together, the city spread out before them like a living, breathing entity. The lights flickered in the distance, a quiet reminder of how far they had come. "You've done it," Vincenzo said softly, his voice low. "Everything you've worked for, everything we've fought for, it's yours." Isabella glanced at him, her heart hammering in her chest. He wasn't just talking about the empire, he was talking about her rise from nothing, from the streets, from a past that hadn't been kind, to standing beside him, equal to him. "I couldn't have done it without you," she replied, her voice steady but thick with emotion. The bond between them pulsed in the space between them, undeniable. It had always been there, but now it was something else, something stronger. He took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles in a quiet, intimate gesture. The touch sent a jolt through her, and she couldn't help but feel how far they had come. How far they had come! The celebration of their success was simple but meaningful. A private dinner with those who had helped them along the way, those who had stood by them through the blood and betrayal. But it wasn't the feast or the accolades that mattered. It was the look in Vincenzo's eyes when he turned to her, the way his gaze softened, his fingers finding hers across the table. "You're not just my partner," he said quietly, his voice low and steady. "You're my equal, and you've earned everything you have." Isabella's chest tightened at the words. There had been times when she hadn't believed it, when she had thought herself too broken to ever be worthy of a place in this world, but now, she saw herself reflected in his eyes, strong and unwavering. She was worthy. "I never thought I'd be here," she whispered, her voice soft. "But I wouldn't want to be anywhere else." He reached across the table, his hand brushing against her cheek, a gesture so simple, yet it felt like everything. The soft touch of his fingers, the warmth of his gaze. It was the moment she realized that they weren't just building an empire, they were building a life. As the months passed, the changes within the organization became more visible. The old ways were gone, replaced by a sense of unity and purpose. The men who had once feared Vincenzo now trusted him, and through him they trusted her. Isabella's rise wasn't just about her, it was about what they had become together. One evening, as they stood atop the rebuilt headquarters, the city sprawling beneath them, they looked out over the legacy they had forged. The setting sun cast long shadows over the city, the sky painted with hues of gold and pink. The future was bright, full of promise. "We've done it," Vincenzo said, his voice soft but filled with conviction. "We've built something real." Isabella stood beside him, her fingers intertwined with his, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her. "We're just getting started," she replied, her voice steady, full of promise. In that moment everything felt possible. They had forged their legacy. Together, a legacy that would last, built on trust, on loyalty, on love. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, they knew one thing with certainty. They were unstoppable. Together they had reclaimed their destinies, and nothing would ever tear them apart. The moon hung high in the sky, its soft light casting a silvery glow across the garden. The air was crisp, the quiet of the night wrapping around them like a blanket. Isabella sat on the stone bench, her fingers lightly tracing the surface of the smooth stone, as if she could still feel the echoes of everything they had been through. Vincenzo stood a few steps away, his back to her, looking out at the distant horizon. The calm of the night didn't seem to fit him, the man who had spent so long fighting, planning, controlling everything around him. But here, now, it was like a weight had finally been lifted from his shoulders. He didn't speak for a long moment, his silence not uncomfortable but deep, full of everything he didn't say. Isabella's voice broke through the quiet, soft but certain. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" Vincenzo's head turned just slightly, his eyes catching hers, but he didn't move. "I do," he replied. His voice was different now, softer, less guarded. "It feels like we've lived lifetimes, but I still can't believe it sometimes. We're here, after everything." She watched him for a moment, noting the subtle shift in him. He had always been a man who had lived with a purpose, a leader who took charge of every situation. But now there was something more to him. Something she had seen growing in him since the beginning, but that he had never fully embraced until recently. "Do you miss it?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "The way things were." For a beat, Vincenzo didn't answer. His gaze drifted back to the horizon, and she could see the way the moonlight danced across his face, highlighting the sharp lines of his jaw, the curve of his lips. She knew what he was thinking. He'd spent years fighting for this empire, fighting for control. And now that it was his, now that it had been rebuilt into something better, something real, He had no idea how to let go of that. But she was there. With him. "Oh," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I don't miss it." "Not any more?" She smiled softly, the weight of the moment sinking in as she moved beside him, her hand brushing against his. The small gesture, simple but meaningful, sent a rush of warmth through her. It was familiar. It was them, the quiet intimacy that they had built, piece by piece. Vincenzo turned slightly to face her, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her heart race, slow and steady. "And you? Do you ever wonder what might have happened if we hadn't crossed paths?" Isabella leaned back against the cool stone, looking up at the moon, feeling its soft light on her skin, its pull deep in her chest. The moon had witnessed everything, the betrayals, the fights, the transformations. It had seen their highs and their lows, the darkness and the light. And now it was seeing them as they were now, together. "No," she said after a moment, the truth settling in her chest, warm and steady. "I don't wonder. Because it brought me here, to this, to you." The words were simple, but there was something in them that held more than what was said. A promise. A truth. A future. Vincenzo's hand moved to hers, his fingers curling around hers with a tenderness she hadn't expected, a slow, deliberate gesture. His thumb brushed over her knuckles as he leaned in slightly, his voice low, quiet, like he was saying something only for her. "I never thought I'd let anyone in. I spent so long building walls. But you made me see things differently." Her breath caught at the vulnerability in his voice, the raw honesty that had taken years to uncover. He wasn't just the cold, calculating Mafia boss anymore. He was the man who had shared his fears, his mistakes, and his vision with her. And for the first time there was nothing left unsaid between them. "I didn't make you see anything," she whispered, her voice steady, but her heart was racing. "Vincenzo needed someone to believe in you." "And now you're the man you were always meant to be." Vincenzo's gaze softened as he looked down at her, his face inches from hers, the space between them so small it almost hurt. He didn't say anything, but his lips hovered just above hers, warm, inviting, as if asking permission to take the next step. And she gave it silently, by closing the distance between them, her lips brushing against his in a slow, sweet kiss. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't about passion or urgency. It was about everything they had been through together, the battles, the struggles, the moments of doubt. And now, finally, it was about the peace that had settled between them. The kiss deepened, the soft pressure of his lips against hers a gentle reminder of how far they had come. She felt his hand on the back of her neck, his fingers threading through her hair as he pulled her closer, his body just barely touching hers. The simple act of their closeness sent a rush of heat through her, but it wasn't just desire, it was connection. They were connected, not just by the battles they had fought, but by everything they had rebuilt together. When they finally pulled away, their foreheads rested together, breaths mingling, the silence between them comfortable, full of everything they had said without speaking. The moon watched over them, its soft light filling the space around them, a quiet witness to the truth they had both come to accept. This was their legacy, forged through blood, through sweat, through tears. And now, in the quiet of the night, with the promise of a new day on the horizon, they knew one thing with absolute certainty. They were ready for whatever came next, together. The moon hung heavy in the sky, casting its silver glow over the city below. The streets, once a battleground of chaos and power struggles, now felt quieter, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The fight was over, the dust had settled, but the weight of the moment still lingered. Isabella stood beside Vincenzo, her back straight and her eyes fixed on the horizon. The city lay before them, a patchwork of old wounds and new growth. It was still their empire, but now it was theirs in a way it never had been before. No longer defined by blood and betrayal, but by the future they were creating together. Vincenzo's presence at her side was solid, comforting, but not suffocating. They had always been equals in the fight, but now there was something more between them, something deeper. "You know," Isabella said, her voice soft but steady, "I used to think everything I wanted was just a dream, something I could never reach." She turned slightly toward him, her eyes meeting his with quiet understanding. "Now, I know that we can shape whatever future we want." Vincent's gaze flicked to hers, the flicker of a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. But it wasn't just any smile. It was the kind that came from knowing they had both fought for this, for each other. "You're right. We've built it, together." Her hand found his, their fingers brushing in that familiar way that felt so natural now, so right. The bond between them had always been there from the first glance to the first fight, but now it was something solid, something unbreakable. They had forged it through fire, and it was stronger than ever. But that didn't mean the future would be easy. "There's still work to do," he continued, his voice a little darker now, the reality of their situation returning. "We've cleared out the old problems, but the world is never static. There will always be challenges, new enemies, new struggles. We'll have to be ready." Isabella squeezed his hand, feeling the weight of his words, but she didn't flinch. There was no fear in her anymore, only determination. "We'll be ready," she said firmly, her gaze never leaving the horizon. "Together." The words hung in the air for a moment, heavy with promise. She didn't need to say more. Neither of them did. The darkness that loomed before them was not a threat. It was simply the unknown. And it didn't scare her anymore. It didn't scare him either. The world would never be free from conflict, from the shadows of the past creeping into the future, but that didn't mean they couldn't carve their own path through it. They had already proven that, and as they stood there side by side, hands intertwined, Isabella knew one thing for sure. They had everything they needed to face whatever came next, not just because of the empire they had built, but because of what they had found in each other. Love, trust, redemption. They had walked through the fire, and now they were standing in the light, ready for whatever came next. Vincenzo turned to her, his eyes steady, the raw intensity still there, but softened now. "We fought for this, and now it's ours. What happens next, we decide." Isabella smiled, her heart steady in her chest. "Together," she echoed softly. "Together. Always." They turned back to face the city, the darkness in front of them, but with no fear. Only a shared resolve. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever tests they would face them as they had always faced everything. Side by side, united by their bond, their love, and the promise of a better world. A world they had the power to create. And in that moment, beneath the quiet watch of the moon, Isabella and Vincenzo knew that nothing could ever tear them apart. The future was theirs, and it was just beginning.